In this video, we will be exploring and covering some of the strangest, craziest operations, like for example, the plan to feminize Hitler by sneaking estrogen into his food, or the plan by the Americans to attach these tiny little bombs to bats and just release them over Japan, to some of the wildest single-man missions, ridiculous World War II inventions and experiments, and much, much more. And a genuine superfood that the German soldiers used to eat in battle, and I have actually sourced some of this, so I will be able to try some of it for the first time here for you all live in this video. So as always, grab a drink. My choice today is English tea with Canadian maple syrup, and join me as we explore the super ultimate World War II iceberg. Tier 1, the origin of Fanta. So a bit of a light one to start off with, but Fanta, for all of those who are not familiar, is this orange flavored fizzy drink that also comes in like strawberry flavor, grape and guana, fruit twist flavor, lemon, blackcurrant, all sorts, but it was actually invented way back when in Nazi Germany. And so what happened was, in the 1940s, America put an embargo on Germany due to them invading Poland, which meant that the Coca-Cola factories in Germany could no longer import the syrup necessary to make Coca-Cola. And so they just did the next best thing, which is to make their own Coca-Cola equivalent drink for the Germans. So they still had the Coca-Cola factories and the plant, etc. in Germany, but since they could no longer get the syrup, they used the leftovers of the leftovers, as they put it, using just scraps basically. They used whey, they used apple pomace, which is basically just kind of like crushed apple skin and core and seeds. It's basically the leftover of what happens when you crush apples to make apple juice. And they took all of that, they brewed it up, they made it fizzy, and they created this drink, which at the time had no name. And so when they were trying to come up with a name for this drink, Max Keith, who was the head of the German Coca-Cola division, he asked his team to just, come on, use your imagination, or their fantasy in German, and one of his salesmen purportedly was like, fantasy. And that's where the name of Fanta comes from. And it more or less replaced Coca-Cola in Germany during the Second World War, with them selling around 3 million cases just in 1943. And the Fanta flavor that we all know and love, which is orange obviously, it wasn't invented until 12 years after this in 1953. And it wasn't even invented by the Germans, it was invented in Italy. So this early version created in Germany probably most likely tasted a bit more like apples, seeing as it used apple scraps and leftovers. But after Germany lost the war, the American Coca-Cola division basically regained control, complete control of the German division, of the German factory, and of all of their recipes. And so the Germans during the war had invented this quite neat little product for them, this new drink of Fanta. And since Coca-Cola now regained the recipe for it, the trademark, etc., they just released it from then on out as Fanta. The Gleiwitz radio station false flag, or the Gleiwitz incident, was a false flag carried out in Germany in 1939. And this is where a bunch of Germans basically dressed up in Polish uniforms and they attacked the Gleiwitz radio station in Germany. After they took over the station, they basically started to broadcast an anti-German message in Polish over the airwaves. And to make this look more convincing, the Germans got a few prisoners from the Dachau concentration camps. They sedated them, they shot them, then dressed them up and disfigured their faces so they couldn't be identified. They also got this one guy, Franciszek Honiok, who was a farmer known to be basically on the side of the Polish, and he had just recently, the day before, actually been arrested by the Gestapo, and so they did the same thing with him. They sedated him, they knocked him unconscious, they shot him dead, and they left him at the scene. And all in all, this looked like a bunch of Polish people and soldiers had attacked Germany, and so the Nazis used this and many other false flag attacks as a pretense basically to invade Poland and go to war with them in 1939. And we know a lot of the details about this from various testimonies given during the Nuremberg trials by, among others, a man named Alfred Nojoks, who was an SS officer who organized these attacks under the direct orders of Reinhard Heydrich and under the orders of Heinrich Müller, who was the head of the Gestapo at the time. time. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was a pact or agreement or deal between the Soviet Union and Germany in 1939, signed by the German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop and the Soviet Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, hence the name of the deal, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And part of this deal was a peace or non-aggression treaty between the two nations for 10 years at a minimum, or until 1949, saying that they wouldn't attack each other, and also some terms on how they would basically carve up most of Eastern Europe. So Poland was up for grabs, as was Finland and the Baltic states and Romania and Czechoslovakia, and it might very well have spelled disaster for the entirety of Western Europe, for Britain, for Switzerland and Spain and more, if the Germans all focused their attacks on the Western Front and didn't have to worry about the East. You know, Britain might very well have been invaded. But, of course, the Germans broke the pact with Operation Barbarossa, you know, when they invaded the Soviet Union just 2 years later in 1941. And, of course, from then on, the Germans had to fight a full two-front war as opposed to just a one-front war, and that very likely led to their downfall. And just quickly, guys, if you are enjoying the video, please do consider subscribing. It is completely free, and I am trying to hit 100,000 subscribers by the end of the year. And if you want to support the channel more than just subscribing, you can always hit the join button, become a member of the channel, just like these lovely people here, or somewhere. As your guys' support does keep the lights on, it keeps the tea flowing. But back to the next entry, which is Operation Paperclip. So this, I think, is a very, very interesting operation, and it is a topic which I could honestly go on for a very long time about, and could probably do a fully dedicated video just covering this one topic. But in short, as we will find out later on in this video, the Germans were absolutely fantastic. They were brilliant at engineering, mathematics, physics. Like take Einstein, for example, you know, Heisenberg, Hahn, Strassmann, Braun, there's Planck, there's Schrödinger and his cat, Hilbert, Klein, just a ton of brilliant, either ethnically German or people who lived in Germany, or some combination of the two. A bunch of the really clever German people, some of whom had Jewish ancestry, like Einstein, they ended up moving out of Germany, out of Europe, and over to America, with a lot of the really clever people even helping with Project Manhattan, or the creation of the atomic bomb in America. And so after Germany lost the war, the Americans in particular thought, we can't just execute or imprison a bunch of these people, you know, a bunch of the German intellectuals, scientists, engineers, etc., who were working in Germany. The Americans said, like, these are some really smart people. We can't just waste their potential. We have to bring them over to America. And so they did just that in Operation Paperclip. They got a bunch of the smartest people, the most competent people over in Germany, and one technology that they were really looking at was rockets, because the Germans were far and away the best at producing rockets, at new rocket technologies, etc., as again we'll learn later on in the video. But after the war, America relocated at least 1,600 scientists, mathematicians, engineers, and their families, many of whom who had Nazi affiliations and ties. They basically pardoned them all. They brought them over to live in the US and to help with the US rocket program, or their rocket programs, their aviation programs, chemistry research, etc. And what would be the largest rocket industry in, you know, the 1940s, 50s, 60s? Well, of course, that would be NASA. And so when NASA was founded in 1958, it was said that half of all the workers, members, management, scientists, etc. working in NASA had some sort of Nazi affiliations. And that was just partly because the German engineers and scientists were just so incredibly effective at making and producing rockets. The phony war months were, quite simply, the months between September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, and May 1940, when Germany invaded France. And between these two periods, basically nothing happened. Or rather, no real land movements happened. Because after Germany invaded Poland, almost immediately after this, France and Britain declared war on Germany. And then all of the sides, France, Britain, Germany, they were like, yep, right, I'm going to come over there and get you. Just give me a little while to, start manufacturing stuff and building up troops and soldiers. And so even though war was declared on that day in 1939, it was a good 7 or 8 months before anyone actually did anything. And I know I'm going to get comments about this. There were various sea-based attacks and fighting, etc. But as I said, there was nothing on land. And it's just kind of funny. France declares war on Germany. Like, I kind of understand Britain not sending troops to Germany immediately because, there's like an ocean in between them. But France is literally on their doorstep. They declare war on Germany, and then they just kind of wait like 8 months before invading Germany. And even then, it was Germany who invaded France. And so, was France ever really going to attack Germany? They just declared war on them and then didn't go to war, in which case, what's even the point of declaring war? It's kind of like being in a pub or a bar or something, and then someone pushes your friend and you're like, right, I'm not going to stand for this. Let's fight. And then they're like, yeah, where do you want to fight? Let's go out back. And you're like, yeah, I'll meet you out back in 18 months and then we're going to fight for sure. What, now? No. I'm not ready to fight now. Just give me like a year and I'll meet you out back. The Demon Core was honestly, truly terrifying. And it was basically this core or sphere, and it was the radioactive powerhouse of a third nuclear bomb that was planned to be dropped on Japan if they didn't surrender. Thankfully, though, they did surrender in September 1945, and so this third weapon was never used. But they did take the core from it. It was made from a plutonium-gallium alloy, and they used it to perform various physics tests. And they were testing the limits of radiation, and all in all, it was a very interesting piece of technology. And I won't get into the full details explaining exactly what it was because that would take up way too much time. But to simplify it, there was something called an initiator, which was this little thing right at the center. And then there was the core or the sphere made from a highly radioactive and unstable form of plutonium, plutonium-239. And then it was encased in a few other things, meaning that you could basically handle this sphere and not die. And when it was put into a bomb, it resembled something like this. And when the bomb was dropped, the front of it would compress, which would compress the core, which would trigger the initiator, which started a chain reaction, which made the core super unstable, leading to a massive chain reaction, which let off all of this energy, and then, yeah, kaboom. But for the men working on this core, it was more or less fine, just as long as you were safe with it. They took they knew all of the precautions you needed to take in order for it not to kill you. So basically, don't drop it, don't make any sudden movements, as if the core was knocked, say you banged the core with a hammer. This wouldn't go so far as to blow up like a nuclear bomb, but it would start a mini chain reaction inside, which would start more and more chain reactions, and you would get something like a little flash of light, and this would basically be the radiation triggering and escaping, and it would likely kill everyone in the room. It'd be kind of like, if I can use a terrible analogy, kind of like a bottle of Coke, and while the Coke is in there, it's just completely stable, it's completely safe to, handle, and just imagine it with the lid open. So you got a bottle of Coke, and so yeah, it's completely safe, but if you were to drop this Coke or perhaps shake it up, then the chemicals inside would start a chain reaction. It'd start to get super bubbly, super fizzy, and instead of being covered in sticky soda, you would be bombarded with deadly levels of radiation. And this being covered in deadly radiation, this actually happened twice between 1945 and 1946. And again, I won't go into the full absolute details of how these accidents happened because it would take up too much time. But basically, each time these various men were in the room, they were studying or working on the core, and they used for these experiments something called reflectors, which was a pretty cool thing. If you can imagine the cores just passively letting off a safe amount of radiation, which allowed the men to, handle it normally handle it safely. These reflectors would basically reflect some of that safe radiation back into the core. And so this would trigger sort of more of a reaction, and it would make the core slightly more unstable. And so the more reflectors you added around it, it raised the unstableness level of this core. And so they could raise the criticality level of the core to do various tests on it. They could have these reflectors close next to the core or further away to adjust the levels. And it was all going well, all going as planned, until the first incident where one of the scientists, a man named Harry Daghlian, he accidentally dropped a reflector onto the core itself, starting a massive soda can chain reaction, and he then later died 25 days later from acute radiation poisoning. And one of the other men who was in the room at that time, who was a private, he was much farther away from the core, and he ended up dying of leukemia 33 years later. And the second incident occurred when a physicist named Louis Slotin had the two halves of this sphere. And so you can imagine the top half and the bottom half, and the standard procedure was to use these things called shims to basically keep a space in between the top half and the bottom half. And this allowed basically a little gap for the radiation to safely escape, whereas if this was closed, then the radiation would kind of bounce around inside, create this giant chain reaction, and create a, soda can analogy. And yeah, that would not be good for anyone. But Slotin didn't like to use these shims. He instead preferred just kind of rocking the little hole, just wedging it open with his screwdriver. And he also, for what it's worth, didn't like wearing like safety gear. It is said that he used to rock up to work in like jeans and cowboy boots. And so yeah, he used this flathead screwdriver, and that way he could not just hold the top half of the sphere up, but also kind of twist it just to get a slightly different height on the gap in the middle, and that way he could very finely adjust the criticality of the core. And this worked perfectly fine until it didn't. And Enrico Fermi, who was a famous physicist working on the Manhattan Project, who was actually the creator of the Fermi paradox, which I believe we covered in the mystery iceberg or in the alien iceberg, but he at one point saw this, and he told Louis that he and his men would be dead within the year if they kept doing this experiment like this. And sure enough, one day the screwdriver slipped, the two core halves just perfectly went together. There was a massive flash of bright light, and the closest man, Slotin, received a super deadly dose of radiation, around 5 times what Daghlian received, and Slotin died of acute radiation poisoning only 9 days later. The other men in the room all received various levels of radiation, but most either died naturally or from something completely unrelated, like the Korean War, for example, or they died 20 or 30 years later of either heart conditions or leukemia or a whole range of things. So the only massively deadly doses were to the two men closest in each incident, and the core was later melted down and it was reused to make other weapons. But interestingly enough, the Demon Core was actually intended to be used in an Operation Crossroads, which was a nuclear weapons test at Bikini Atoll, which was a series of these small islands surrounded by a lagoon in the Pacific Ocean, and they did actually end up doing nuclear tests there in the 1940s and 50s, massively contaminating the area with radiation. And that is actually where we get the name and the location Bikini Bottom from in SpongeBob, with the idea being that, they nuked Bikini Atoll and the radiation went down to the bottom of Bikini Bottom, and this radiation created sentient sponges, talking crabs and starfish, and a ton of the other characters and references that you see in the show. And with all of this talk of war and nukes, it can get a little concerning. And wouldn't it be nice to have a book or a codex that stored all of the knowledge and information necessary to rebuild civilization if things were ever to go, end of the worldy? Well, here I have what is called the book. Like literally, it is the book by a company called Hungry Minds. And honestly, it has no right being this amazing. It is designed to be the only book you would need to restore civilization if, it went poof. And as you can see, it contains information on absolutely everything. From how to produce beer, how to grow different grains, how to make chocolate raw from the bean, how to produce penicillin, you know, the insane life-saving drug used massively in World War II to help prevent infections. Like, that is definitely information that you do not want to lose if civilization ever comes to an end. And also how to play chess, how to do basic dentistry, how tanks and firearms work, how genes are produced, how to pickle and preserve vegetables, how to treat wounds, how to make bandages from spider webs, just, you know, all of humanity's greatest inventions. They are all here in this book, and once again, as you can see, this book is just absolutely huge. I mean, it's like reading an ancient codex or something. The pages in here are all super high quality. You know, they're produced on matte paper, and they are all gorgeously hand illustrated by real human artists, no AI. All of the research and writing is also done by humans, and it comes in a hardcover with, if I just turn it around, but it's got this really cool, like, raised texture on the front, and it also kind of, you know, glimmers in the light. Like, for me, this is not just a book, it is really a piece of art. And I could spend like 20 minutes reading through and admiring the art on each of these pages, which it did actually take me a fair while to get through the entire book, just because I spent so long on each page. But they are absolutely beautiful. There are over 400 pages in this entire book, and it raised originally over $2.3 million in crowdfunding before its release. And since then, it has become a worldwide bestseller. So just grab a warm drink, cut out the noise, and read through the book slowly, I would recommend, at your own pace, as it is an absolute experience. And if you've got a friend or a loved one who enjoys history, or mechanics, or engineering, or biology, chemistry, weaponry, or if they are, like myself, just a curious human who loves learning about the world, and facts and information, or if they are a prepper sort of individual who would appreciate all of this absolutely essential knowledge in, you know, solid form that you won't lose access to if, you know, the internet goes down or the power goes out or something, or if you just think that it would look beautiful on someone's shelf. Because I'll be honest, it is probably the most beautiful book that I own. But if you know anyone into any of these things, the book also makes for a great birthday gift, Christmas gift, Father's Day gift, or gift to celebrate their 12th year in a row wearing hats, or whatever it is. But if you want to pick one up for you or your loved ones, or even your liked ones, head over to hungryminds.com, link is in the description below, or use this beautiful QR code. And while you're there, if you use the code Connors with an S, 10, that is Connors 10, you can get 10% off your order. And can I just say that I don't want this to sound too, you know, ad ready, because while it is an ad, from the bottom of my heart, this is genuinely a very, very cool book that I absolutely love the look of. I love the content inside. It is really a full-on experience. I massively enjoyed it, and I would personally highly recommend it to anyone that I know. And with that, let's get on to our next entry, the Polish Cipher Bureau's pre-war breakthrough on Enigma. So we did cover the Enigma machine and the code in the previous Iceberg, but the British, especially Alan Turing and his team, often get the bulk of the credit, if not most or all of the credit, for solving Enigma, even though the Poles did an absolute ton of the work. And they solved the early Enigma code back in the early 1930s, and this was incredibly impressive. It was honestly really something. The Germans would make it more complicated, the Poles would solve that, and then it was just, yeah, back and forth between the two. And eventually, before Poland was invaded, the mathematicians really, I mean, they couldn't keep up. And they knew once they were invaded, the research would slow down. And so they sent their research and findings over to the French and the British. And they also managed to capture an Enigma translator machine. They completely dismantled it. They took notes about all the parts, how it was made, and then they put it all back together, packaged it up, and sent it off to where it was originally supposed to go. And the Germans never knew that the Poles had basically intercepted this, completely dismantled it, completely studied it, and it was an absolutely phenomenal job. And so when Poland was invaded, the British did crack on with, trying to solve Enigma. They got Alan Turing in on the job, and they did do a fantastic job, but it was very much so on the back of these Polish mathematicians, and due in large part to the work of the Polish. It was thought that this helped the British solve Enigma years sooner than they otherwise would have, and in the process ended up saving millions of Allied lives. Tier 2, Coco Chanel. So you may know this name from the bags, from the fashion, the perfume, Chanel No. 5, but she was an actual woman, a fashion designer, a very good one, based in France during World War II. And funnily enough, she was good friends with Churchill before the war, and during the war, during the German invasion of France, she was romantically involved with a German spy named Hans Gunther von Dinklage, which is perhaps the most German name that I've ever heard of. And she also tried to use the Nazi anti-Jewish laws, which prevented Jews from owning businesses, to wrestle control of her company Chanel from her Jewish business owners or business partners, the Wertheimer family. But for various reasons, this didn't work, as her business partners had foreseen this and they had given control of this company, of Chanel, over to a Christian French businessman named Felix Amiot, or Amiot. So when Chanel said, look, Nazis, they can't control this company by law because they're Jews, so, can I have full control over it? They looked through the records and they said, actually, they don't technically own the company anymore. This Christian Frenchman owns it, and so we can't really do anything about that. So she still had, partial control and ownership of the company, and after the war, this Frenchman then gave control of the company back to the Wertheimer family, and so they once again controlled a lot of the company. But at one point during the war, there was a plot for Coco Chanel to go to England and to meet her old friend, Winston Churchill, who was obviously by this point the Prime Minister of England. And the plot was for her to try and convince the English, or for her to convince Churchill to convince the English to end the war. And so yeah, she was kind of in ways like a spy for Germany at this point. So very strange. This obviously didn't work, and after the war, she was going to be charged with various things like being a collaborator with the Nazis, being a spy, charged for treason, sabotage, various potential charges. But her old friend Winston Churchill stepped in and said, no, don't charge her. She was doing all of this under duress, basically. And so, with the influence of the Prime Minister, she was never charged. After the war, Chanel moved to Switzerland and later returned to Paris. She made a new deal with the Wertheimers where they would keep control of the company fully, and she would get 2% of all Chanel 5 worldwide sales and a bunch of the profits from Chanel during the war, making her at the time a multi-millionaire. And also, they agreed to pay for basically all of her living expenses going forward for the rest of her life. But obviously, in exchange for that, they would keep full control of the company. And that was basically that. She did some fashion work over the years, and she died in 1971 at the age of 87. Reportedly exhausted, angry, tyrannical, some said, which I don't know how you're tyrannical as an old lady at 87, and she was, in the end, very lonely. And that was basically the story of Coco Chanel. And towards the end, on her last night, she basically felt ill. She went to bed early, and her last words were to her maid saying, "You see, this is how you die," which, I mean, it's pretty badass. Dior. And no, we're not just going to go through every perfume company in the world, but Dior, founded by Christian Dior, who Christian was another French fashion designer during World War II, but he kept his fashion and design company open during the German occupation of France, and he continued to work and to produce products and designs for the Nazis and for their wives, designing and making dresses, various other things and items. But unlike Chanel, he was never really a supporter of the Nazis. He was massively loyal to France, but he decided to basically use his company, use his connections to make a bunch of money by designing clothes for various Nazis, various Germans, and then to use this money he made to fund French resistance movements. And so yeah, it's like the Germans were basically paying him money that was basically being rerouted and then being used to attack the Germans. And Christian Dior's sister, Catherine Dior, was a resistance fighter, and she was actually captured and tortured by the Gestapo. She refused under torture to give any information about her resistance or about her friends or anything like that, and she was then thrown into a labor camp. And at the time, Christian must have assumed that, she would die in there. He didn't have any updates on her, but she was, when the war was over, she did survive the camps, and she was freed in 1945. She then returned to Paris, and so when Christian released his first perfume in 1947, he named it Miss Dior after his sister, Catherine Dior. And that is where the name comes from. Hugo Boss. Okay, so this is the last one, I promise. But we've covered someone who was very against the Nazis, being Dior. We've covered someone who was kind of in the middle, wasn't, a massive pro-Nazi or anti-Nazi. She just kind of went along with it for her own benefit, which was Coco Chanel. And now we have Hugo Boss, who you might recognize as being a major brand in today's day and age. And he, by contrast, was an early and active member of the Nazi Party from as early as 1931. And he, at the time, made all sorts of uniforms for the Nazi Party, from the SS uniform to the SA brown shirts, also the Hitler Youth uniforms, and much, much more. And this contract with the Nazis, with the government, resulted in the sales of Hugo Boss going from around 38,000 Reichmarks in 1932 to over 3.3 million just 9 years later. So an increase of around 100 times as many sales in just a few short years. And when Germany was defeated, Hugo Boss was designated a collaborator and beneficiary of the Nazi regime. And so he was fined with these huge amounts. He was stripped of his right to vote and of his right to own and run a company. And so his son-in-law from then on out basically owned Hugo Boss and ran it. And Hugo Boss died just 3 years after this in 1948 from an abscess in his tooth, which is a very boring way to die, I guess. But it's crazy. It's very interesting for me covering these super well-known brands, these fashion brands and perfume brands, and looking back way back in the day, the actual people that founded them, that used to manage them, that named the companies after themselves, and where the origins of a lot of these companies actually come from. Operation Alaska, or Finlaska, or New Finland, not to be confused with Newfoundland or Newfoundland, was a plan by the US proposed in 1940 to basically take a bunch of Finnish refugees into Alaska to live if the Soviet Union ended up fully conquering Finland. And it's kind of funny in a way because Russia sells Alaska to America and then invades Finland over here, and then America would have taken the Finnish all the way around the world over to America and then back over to what used to be Russia, but is now America, but is Alaska. And although the Soviet Union did invade Finland in 1939 and actually took some territory, they never fully invaded Finland, due mostly, I think, to the Finnish being complete beasts. They were so efficient in their defense. They would stalk and attack the invading Russians in the snow, wearing full white camouflage, with the Russians also not being fully prepared for the war, for the weather. And we will actually cover one of the more famous Finnish defenders in a future entry. But obviously the migration to Alaska wasn't necessary. The Finnish later launched a counterattack on the Soviet Union, actually teaming up with the Germans to attack Russia, and they themselves took some Russian land in return. Then there was a bit of a back and forth. It ended in a stalemate, more or less, and the pre-World War II country lines were restored, and a relative peace was brokered in the area. August Landmesser is a very interesting fellow. And if you'll see from this photo, it's just a regular historical photo. Everyone here is, doing the Nazi salute. Everyone except this one guy who seemingly refused. And as you can imagine, around this time in 1936, refusing to salute Hitler may very well have gotten you arrested, tortured, and or killed, and or shipped off to some death camp somewhere. But August Landmesser joined the Nazi Party in 1931, and he thought, this is definitely where the country is going, and so he thought by joining the Nazi Party that this would secure him employment for the future. Then a few years later, he ended up marrying a Jewish woman by the name of Irma Eckler, and because of this, he was expelled from the party. Then they had their first kid. The family tried to flee to Denmark in 1937, but they were detained at the border for August being a race traitor and for basically marrying a Jewish woman. They were soon then acquitted with the warning that, look, if you keep this up, we're going to arrest you again. And of course, he did keep this up. He stayed with Irma. They weren't too shy about their marriage and family. And just a few months later, August and Irma were once again arrested. They were put in separate concentration camps where August was eventually released from. And Irma, well, we don't really know exactly what happened to her. We can track her movement between different various camps, but then after a while of these moving from camp to camp, there is just kind of silence. So it is widely thought that along the way somewhere or in one of these camps, she ended up dying. Their children were all put in an orphanage and then raised by their grandparents. And August was soon drafted into a penal battalion, which is basically an army draft for criminals, and he died in 1944. And so a tragic family tale for sure, but it is thought that the man in this photo was August Landmesser, as it's not 100% confirmed. Someone else has also claimed that it was their specific relative in this photo, but either way, that is the tale of August Landmesser. Operation Tannenbaum was the plan by the Germans to invade and take over Switzerland and also Liechtenstein. But they basically couldn't do it, or didn't really try to do it, because one, there wasn't a massive benefit to invading these countries, and two, Switzerland was built like an absolute tank. Hitler actually at one point said about the Swiss that, and I quote, "Switzerland possesses the most disgusting and miserable people and political system. The Swiss are the mortal enemies of the new Germany." He saw Switzerland as a state that shouldn't exist and said it was created in error, and now that Germany was becoming all-powerful, it should basically be consumed by the other countries and dissolved. He essentially saw Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Austria, and the Netherlands, and the Alsatians, and the Bohemians, or the Czech. He saw all of these basically as like German people who would one day and should be united as one Germany against whoever would oppose them, which is obviously why he annexed Austria so early on, and probably partly why he invaded Czechoslovakia. And the Swiss, anticipating an invasion by the Germans, the Swiss elected a kind of army or war general. He made preparations for war. He manufactured and bought weapons and arms. They recruited troops, and they gave up basically some of their lower lands in Switzerland, planning to basically consolidate up in the upper parts of Switzerland and make it this unimpregnable mountain fortress from which they could never be removed. And honestly, it likely would have worked, which is probably why the Germans never actually went ahead with their invasion. Switzerland didn't serve that much of a benefit for Germany. It didn't have any ports, it didn't really have any decent resources that they needed, and fighting a difficult, drawn-out, mountainous war using a ton of resources here, while they also had to fight France and the UK in the north, and also Africa down in the south, and Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union out in the east, it probably wasn't a great idea to invade Switzerland. But Operation Tannenbaum was the name of the operation that they would have gone ahead with if they ever decided to do so. The amount of tea the British bought for their troops is absolutely hilarious when you look into it. So in 1942, tea is listed and tallied up as one of the top 5 things bought by the UK government by weight. More than many other types of weapons and ammunition, more than bombs. The sheer weight and volume of tea they bought, mainly from India, was just stereotypically absurd. They bought in 1942, the entire exportable surplus of tea from India and Sri Lanka. So basically anything the Indians didn't drink and keep for themselves, everything else was going to Britain, with them buying around 698 million pounds of tea. And they stored this tea in over 500 locations up and down the country. And this was basically to safeguard it from German bombing, because of course they did. And it is estimated that there was at least 30 million tons of tea in Britain at any one point in time. The British civilians got a certain amount of tea per day in their rations. The British soldiers got a bit more. And it was said that a single battalion could use up around 500 liters of fuel per day just to brew their tea. And of course, not one to keep the regenerative, beneficial, some would say godlike, miraculous benefits of tea to themselves. The British one night decided to drop 75,000 little tea bombs, as they were called, little packages of 1-ounce tea bags over the Netherlands, and this was in 1941, for the Dutch to find and drink, and in an aim to basically boost their morale, which, honestly, tea is just magical. The Battle of Castle Itter. So, I can't remember if I covered this entry in a previous Iceberg, but it is one of the most amazing stories in World War II that I have ever read about. But basically, Castle Itter was this castle in Austria that the Germans had converted into a prison. And in this prison, they held various prisoners, but most notably, they held famous French, rich, important prisoners and people. So celebrities, ex-politicians, army generals, even a former tennis pro, all held in this prison. And that was kind of fine while the war was still going on. But when Germany started to lose the war, various groups started to retreat back to Germany. And basically, I'm kind of summarizing here, but basically the prisoners were able to take over and secure the entire prison. And it was a very strange mix. You had members of the Wehrmacht, or the regular German army, who had abandoned the Nazi cause. You also had various European prisoners, and also you had the French VIP people, politicians, the tennis player, and they had all, between all these people, they had captured this castle and were now defending it against the SS, or the Nazi soldiers who were trying to recapture the castle. One of the prisoners had the previous day headed out to seek some help from these American forces, who were at the time in a town around 40 miles away, and another prisoner had gone out on a bike to seek help from some Austrian resistance forces. And these Austrian resistance forces had actually joined up with some Wehrmacht defectors, notably Major Josef Gangl. And Gangl was like, yo, chill, the war is over, we have lost, we should just surrender to the Americans, screw the SS, we're not killing anyone anymore, it's over. And the SS members were a little more diehard, they were a little more extreme, as they always were, and they typically wanted to, execute any prisoners that they found. They wanted to keep fighting for Germany, and so especially towards the end of the war, there typically was this kind of disconnect, this divide between the regular German soldiers and troops and the SS troops. And all the members occupying this castle, they had, at the time, they had limited manpower, they had limited supplies and weapons and ammunitions, and soon after this, a force of 150 SS soldiers who had been stationed nearby decided to attack and recapture the castle, resulting in the Battle of Itter. So you had the SS soldiers on one side, and on the other side you had various French and European prisoners and the VIPs, former prime ministers, an ex-tennis pro, the sister of Charles de Gaulle. You also had members of the Austrian resistance, you had Wehrmacht defectors, and you also had US tankers and infantry. And you also had a man named Kurt Siegfried Schrader, who was an SS soldier who was injured and left at the castle when the other SS members decided to abandon it. But the prisoners basically befriended him, and he, in the end, actually joined forces with all of the allies, and he genuinely helped to hold off the castle from the attacking SS. Jean Borotra, who was the tennis pro player, he even offered to, and did, vault over the wall and slip through the SS lines and head out to get US reinforcements. And just as the fight seemed to be slipping through their fingers just as the SS men were overwhelming their position and looking to take the castle. Just at that point, the US reinforcement troops showed up and basically decisively ended the battle. Only a single defender died in the battle, that being Major Joseph Gangle, who was shot while trying to move the former French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud to safety. And for this, he was honored as an Austrian national hero, and he even had a street in the nearby Rorgel named after him. But the SS force was defeated. They captured around 100 SS soldiers and fighters as prisoners, and the SS officer who helped defend the castle, Kurt Siegfried Schrader, was later given a 2-year prison sentence for obviously being a member of the SS, but it was later reduced due to his actions in helping defend the Itter castle. And so yeah, a very cool battle. A lot of the prisoners actually didn't hide away, even though they were in some cases ex-politicians or just rich French people who had never really fought in a war themselves. They still, a lot of them, ended up grabbing a weapon, grabbing a gun, and heading up to the walls in order to help defend the castle, with the tennis pro player even asking for a US military uniform and a rifle so that he could do his bit. So a great story, honestly, one that I may someday do a full video on, as it's probably one of my favorite World War II battles and stories that I have ever read. Lebensborn. So in the last Iceberg, I covered the concept of Lebensraum, which translates roughly to living space, and this was the space or the land that Hitler said the German people needed in order to flourish as a people. And this was typically expressed in, their invading other countries in order to take more land, in order to increase the size of Germany. But there was also another concept called Lebensborn, or living fount, or fount of life, fountain of life, and it was the idea, the government program that basically promoted pure life that is increasing the amount of German births in Germany during World War II. It was set up in 1935 with the idea being like, okay, we have falling birth rates, and in a war, in, the upcoming World War II, we will lose a ton of young men, and so we need to basically up those birth rates, preferably with, as the Nazis called them, racially pure children. So it was a way both for the wives of SS soldiers to go and have their kids get a bunch of care and support while their husbands were at war or at work. And so this helped encourage them to have more children, and also for unmarried German women to go and be basically breeding mares, so to speak, where these unmarried women would go there, they would have kids, and there would actually be awards and medals given out to the women who produced the most pure Aryan babies. And with the League of German Girls, which was the female wing of the Hitler Youth Group, with them being instructed to recruit young women with the potential to become good breeding partners for some of the SS officers. The women here would receive full support both with looking after the babies, and they had maids, etc. to, do a bunch of the work. And if they didn't want the kids, they also had an orphanage attached to this movement, and a full adoption program for the German families in Germany to basically take on as many of these kids as they wanted to. And so they made having kids easier, they made looking after the kids easier, they made the financial downside of having to pay for, your kids much less extreme, and they made adoption easier. They basically made everything to do with childbirth and children much, much easier. And this, as I said, was a way to promote having kids and to slowly raise the population of Germany. And by the end of the war, there were dozens of these facilities set up, mostly in Germany, but also some in Norway, in Austria, Poland, Denmark, and a few other countries. And there were an estimated 16 to 20,000 children born in these homes by 1945. Operation Foxley was the British plot to kill Hitler. Not very creative, I know, but it did kind of make sense for the Allies at the time that since Hitler was, a massive personality, it wasn't quite a cult of personality, but it was kind of near that. The Allies thought, hey, if we just assassinate Hitler, that'll kind of bring down the Nazi regime, or at least it would, splinter it, fraction it, and so it'll be much easier to fight Germany and take over that way. It's not so straightforward like, yeah, just kill this one guy and then the war is guaranteed to be over. You could get a guy take over who's more effective than Hitler, who has a better military sense. Like, there's all sorts of variables to take into consideration when planning something like this. But they did have a few potential assassination plots. They had one to poison him, they had one to use a special gun to assassinate him, one to use explosives on his personal train, the America, which we will cover in a bit, but none of these plans were ever fully carried out. And so one plan was to basically snipe him while he was in this special chateau in the south of France. And it was this place that he used to go to every now and then. And while he was there, he liked to go on a 20-minute walk every morning to basically clear his head. And he always insisted on being alone, meaning that while he was here, there was a small opportunity to set up a sniper somewhere nearby and to pop him while he was out walking. And this plan was planned. It was considered. They were to parachute in a German-speaking Pole and a British sniper. They also had a shopkeeper who lived nearby who very much hated Hitler, and so the plan was for him to house them secretly until Hitler arrived, and then they would basically set up the sniper somewhere nearby, and yeah, that was the plan. But after they had set up this plan, they didn't know it at the time, but Hitler had already come and gone from the chateau for the last time, as after July the 14th, 1944, he would never return to that chateau. They also planned to poison his water on board his special train, but they basically needed too many parts, too many things to go just right for that to work. So they ended up giving up on that idea. And in all, Hitler was the target of dozens of assassination attempts over the years. From the podium where he gave his yearly speech being secretly planted with explosives, but he ended up ending his speech 13 minutes early. And so by the time the bombs went off, which actually killed 8 people and injured dozens more, he was already back on his train, safe and sound. There was also a bomb placed on his plane disguised as bottles of Cointreau, but that bomb didn't go off either. Another one involved Rudolf Christoph Freiherr von Gersdorf, these Germans and their names. But this man, he planned and actually did wear these explosives under his coat and planned to basically hug or greet Hitler and then have the bombs go off, basically killing Hitler and obviously himself. But once again, Hitler rushed through the expedition and so was 10 minutes ahead of schedule and so completely missed this man. And there were, yeah, as I said, dozens more, way too many to list here. But one of the more famous assassination attempts was the 20th of July plot where Klaus von Stauffenberg, who had actually planned or attempted a few other assassinations of Hitler over the years, but importantly, nobody really knew about this. You know, the SS and the Gestapo or Hitler didn't know that Klaus was involved, but he was secretly, unbeknownst to everyone, part of a secret German resistance, comprised mainly of Wehrmacht officers, and the plan was to bring this briefcase into this meeting with Hitler, and the briefcase was filled completely with explosives. And for those of you who know, Klaus did manage to successfully bring this briefcase into the, meeting room. He placed the briefcase down next to where Hitler would sit, but another man named Heinz Brandt unknowingly moved this briefcase. He's like, oh, what's this briefcase doing here? He thought it's just kind of in the way a little bit. He just moved it over to the other side. And so when the bomb went off, Brandt, the guy who moved the briefcase, ended up being killed. But since he moved it kind of out of the way of Hitler, and the table legs took, some of the force of the bomb. And so Hitler simply suffered from a busted eardrum, a scratched eye, and some burnt up trousers instead of being blown to smithereens. But Klaus at the time didn't know this. He knew that he planted the bomb. He went outside to take, a quick call, and then the bomb went off. There was chaos everywhere, and Klaus actually believed that this assassination attempt was a success. So he followed through with the plan to work with a bunch of the other Wehrmacht officers and command. They started slowly to kind of take over major cities, sort of a coup d'etat of sorts. And the plan was, with Hitler dead, they would take over the major cities and then slowly take over the rest of the Nazis, and then take over the government, and then make peace with the Allies and bring an end to this war. But obviously Hitler didn't die, and the SS and Gestapo soon found out that Klaus was involved in this, and they killed him that same night. Then they organized a massive, thorough investigation of this assassination attempt, where they captured and arrested more than 7,000 people, and they basically cleaned out house as much as they could. You know, anyone who was even remotely involved in this plot, they either killed them or arrested them or sent them off to a camp, with, after this investigation, roughly 5,000 people being executed and a further 7,000 being arrested. Many of the assassination attempts likely didn't work just because of how unpredictable Hitler seemed to be. And I think this was probably on purpose, by design. You know, Hitler knew that loads of people wanted to kill him, and so often he would keep people on their toes. He would cancel events, he would cancel speeches and meetings, he would go to places early, or go to them late, or leave early, or let stations know that he was turning up on his train only a few minutes before he rocked up. And he was very, very cautious with information regarding his whereabouts, which, as I said, does kind of make sense if you have this many people trying to kill you. Führer's Sonderzug, or in English, Führer's Special Train, which just sounds adorable. But this train, nicknamed America, was named so because apparently Hitler wanted to pay homage to the European conquest of America. And so he apparently saw himself as a conqueror of Europe, I guess. But after he declared war on America, he removed the America name from the train, which is understandable. But this was basically one of Hitler's headquarters. And with it being a train, it was incredibly mobile, obviously. It was also an absolute tank, consisting of the outer trains being super duper specially armored anti-aircraft trains, which were equipped with anti-aircraft guns and cannons, as well as a baggage car for storage, a dining car, a bathing car, some sleeping compartments, a conference room car, a Begleet Kommando Wagen. I have no idea how to pronounce that word. What even is that word? Begleet Kommando Wagen, which hosted a top-tier 22-man security team equipped with guns and weapons, all to basically protect Hitler. And there was also Hitler's personal carriage, the Führerwagen. And yeah, it was pretty handy. Hitler could travel around in this thing, and he could also do a bunch of his command and headquartery type stuff from it. So yeah, all in all, pretty cool idea. Kamikaze Kaiten was a very unique weapon by the Japanese, where it was basically a man-guided torpedo that was attached to submarines. The subs would drive out to waters with enemy targets nearby, and then someone would climb into one of the torpedoes and launch off the submarine. And while inside the torpedoes, the single man inside had access to steering, he had access to speed and fuel controls, he could use the periscope to basically see where he was, and the tip of the torpedo was a big-ass explosive. And the plan was basically to use these as like better targeted, better controlled, manually driven kamikaze torpedoes, as opposed to the regular dumb torpedoes that didn't have really any guidance or steering. And so when these kamikaze Kaiten smashed into ships, mostly, they would hopefully detonate the explosive, doing massive damage and hopefully sinking the ship. But although a bunch were produced and over 100 were launched, they weren't really, in the end, that successful, and more often than not just resulted in the death of the man inside. And in total, they only resulted in around 2 hits on Allied ships, those being the USS Messina and the USS Underhill. So yeah, not very effective, but very Japanese, I would say. Like, honestly, everything from them was just like kamikaze, it would seem. And yeah, That is the Kamikaze Kaiten. Neuschwabenland, or New Schwabia, because I guess the old Schwabia wasn't good enough, but this was an area of the Antarctic dubbed New Schwabia by the Nazis in 1939, named after Schwabia, an area in Germany, and it was basically their claim to the Antarctic. But it was never officially recognized as Germany's, and after they lost the war, it was still never recognized, and actually all of these areas which are claimed by various different countries, Argentina, Chile, Australia, France, New Zealand, Norway, Britain, since 1961, there was a global treaty put in place, which was agreed to by most countries, called the Antarctic Treaty, which basically is the same as space in a way, that says that, okay, no individual country owns space, hence the International Space Station, and also no individual country shall own Antarctica. And so all of these claims to the land, all of these segments, they were basically all frozen in 1961, and they aren't officially accepted. So even though it's like the British part of Antarctica, you know, the British region, it's basically the same as Britain saying like, I own New York or something. You know, America's like, oh yeah, okay, just say whatever you want, but you know, you don't actually own New York. And it's the same for all of these segments in the Antarctic. Soy Boy Hitler. So this one is actually insane. And it was a top secret plan that was only discovered or rediscovered while reviewing declassified World War II documents. And the plan was basically for British spies to lace Hitler's food with estrogen, which is the female sex hormone, to basically slowly feminize Hitler. And the plan was to make him less aggressive so that perhaps he was less violent during the war and he was more passive, and then this would allow the Allies to, in theory, win more battles and then eventually win the whole war. So yeah, an insane tactic which, I mean, maybe could have worked in some strange way. You know, there were spies who apparently did have access to Hitler's food and would have in some way been able to spike his food. But in that case, why not just poison his food? Unless either they wanted Hitler alive for whatever reason, or they thought if he had food tasters, then the food tasters would die, and so that wouldn't work. And so yeah, maybe the food tasters wouldn't pick up on the fact that there was extra estrogen in the food, and so this was a way of kind of slowly poisoning or influencing Hitler without anybody knowing. So yeah, as I said, just an insane plan, an insane operation, but it is one that the Allies never actually went through with. Operation Downfall was the plan by the Allied forces for taking over Japan in 1945, and they planned to invade in parts first the southern main island of Japan, Kyushu, then a few months later the invasion of the main island, Honshu, and if they went through with this, it would have been the largest amphibious operation or invasion in history, surpassing D-Day, which still is to this day, and was up until that time, the largest ever amphibious invasion. But yeah, Operation Downfall would have been even larger. And the Japanese knew how most of this invasion would go. They had their own defensive plans and were determined to fight and die to the very last man, woman, and child in order to protect their land. And so the estimates for deaths and casualties that would have occurred on this land invasion was likely to be over 1 million Allied troops and likely millions of Japanese troops and civilians. But in the end, this wasn't necessary. The US decided instead to drop 2 nukes, one in Nagasaki and one in Hiroshima, which did, in a strange way, if you can think about it like this, it did save millions of lives because the alternative was this land invasion. And from Japan's perspective, they didn't know if America was out of nukes now. You know, they didn't know if this was their last one, or if they just had one more, or if they had a dozen more, or 100 more. You know, they didn't know if the Americans made this insane breakthrough, which allowed nukes to be made like Cheetos, you know, just on a factory line, just hundreds of nukes. And so after they were hit with these 2 massive bombs, they in the end gave in to an unconditional surrender, which of course removed the need for a boots on the ground invasion and meant that Operation Downfall was never carried out. The V-weapons. So the V-weapons were honestly very, very cool. And in fact, the V in V-weapons stood for very cool. No, they didn't. They stood for vengeance. And these were basically called flying bombs developed by the Nazis. And as you can see, They were like these little planes, and they were launched from these ramps, and they were aimed directly at London. And basically, after launching them, the fuel within them would kind of keep them flying, the wings would keep them in the air, and they were equipped with a little odometer, which basically measured distance traveled. And so when these flying missiles had traveled the distance to London, they triggered off, the fuel stopped, and they sent the missiles straight into a nosedive, exploding into whatever was below them. And they were very, very cool little bits of tech. The Germans absolutely bombarded the southeast of England with them, and they fired almost 10,000 of these, with 2,500 of them successfully landing in the London area. They caused around 6,000 deaths in London and 18,000 serious injuries, and destroyed a ton of buildings and infrastructure, all of them being launched from sites in the north of France. But there were a few cool, like, little tidbits of engineering for these. Like, for example, they also had an internal timer that was set to basically self-detonate shortly after the missile fell. And this was so that if any of the missiles were duds, so, if they didn't blow up when they fell naturally, as typically happened with almost every weapon, but this would ensure that the British weren't able to secure these explosives and take them apart and look at all the technology and little tricks they used on them, hence these self-timed detonations. And these little plain rocket things, these were called the V1 weapons, because there was also a V2, which was quite a bit different. It wasn't exactly in the same style, and it was actually the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile, built, of course, by Germany and fired at London. But these V2 missiles were a completely different type of animal. Like, they had a slightly larger warhead, they had an effective range of around 30% more than the V1s, but that is kind of where most of the similarities ended. As you can see, they weren't cruise missiles that looked like planes like the V1s. They instead looked more like rockets, and they performed quite a bit like rockets in that they shot up into space, and they shot them up so high they went up to space and then basically landed down in London. And these V2 rockets were actually the first man-made object to reach space, because no other rocket, no other plane, nothing that man has created ever broke the space barrier before, and they were also the first man-made objects to break the sound barrier, traveling at around 3,500 miles per hour, or over 5,500 kilometers per hour. So as I mentioned before, and I'll probably mention again sometime, the Germans were absolutely insane at rockets and at all things engineering, which obviously explains why the US took so many of the German scientists and engineers and all of that after World War II. But the V2 was around 20 times as expensive as a V1 missile, and it did roughly the same damage, like maybe 10% more, 20% more, but definitely not 20 times more. And so the V2 rockets were a little inefficient when it came to pure damage. But some of the benefits were they went up so high into space that you couldn't really see them as they were coming down. You couldn't really shoot them out of the sky with the technology of the time. And you also couldn't hear them coming because, as I said, they were faster than sound. So the rockets would first hit wherever they were going to hit, and then afterwards you would get a large crack sound, a large explosion sound, and so, at least psychologically, they must have been absolutely terrifying. And they also traveled around 7 times the speed of a regular missile, and so just like physically, you also had no time to react. And so yeah, the V2s were an absolute beast, but also the V1s were incredibly effective. They were a lot cheaper. They were able to just, repeatedly shoot them out at London. They caused an absolute ton of damage, and as they were flying through the air, they would often make, a screeching or whistling noise, giving them the nickname by the Allies of Buzz Bomb or the Doodle Bug, because, they sounded sometimes like a little bzzz, little bug flying through the sky and filled with high explosives. And when France was taken back by the Allies, they destroyed a lot of these launch sites, which meant that the Germans had to make new launch sites from Germany, and since they were this far back, they could no longer reach London, and so they instead turned their fire towards Antwerp, which was a very important shipping port that was controlled by the Allies in Belgium. Not one step back. So after Operation Barbarossa by the Germans in 1941, with the Germans deciding to invade the Soviet Union, Stalin noticed that the Red Army, his army, was losing a bunch of men and losing a bunch of ground. And when he investigated this, he was informed that a lot of the men were basically retreating. Like, not all of these soldiers, obviously, but there was kind of this growing idea that we are an absolutely huge country, the Soviet Union, and we have basically infinite space compared to the Germans, so we can strategically retreat when we need to, and eventually draw out the Germans, and they will run out of men or supplies or time or whatever. And Stalin basically said, that is absolute nonsense. He said, we're giving up so much ground, we're losing access to factories and farms and to our women and civilians. And so he released this order number 227. And I'll scroll through this entire message he wrote on the screen. So, feel free to pause it to read it in full if you want. But it basically says everything that I just summed up, and it ends with the line, this leads to the conclusion, it is time to finish retreating. Not one step back. Such should now be our main slogan. And he then says this should be read out to every company, every cavalry, every squadron, battery, all commands and headquarters, so basically everyone, and that this would be their new rule. No retreating, not a single step back. If you are being flanked or overrun or the battle is hopeless or anything, you stay there and you fight and you die. And to enforce this idea, he ordered, firstly, that each battalion had basically a separate unit of men whose job was solely to stay at the back lines and to either capture or shoot any Red Army soldiers who decided to retreat or to run away. And these captured soldiers would then, if they weren't killed, they would then be placed in a penal battalion, and these special battalions of basically retreaters or runaways, they would basically be complete fodder. They would be sent out to battle to the absolute front lines. They would be like the first people over the top of the trenches, so to speak. They would be sent first into the missions where death was all but guaranteed and where success was impossible. And so the soldiers kind of had the option of you either stay on the front lines and fight and die, or you try and retreat where you'll be shot by your own men. And if you're not shot by your own men, then you'll be captured, put in one of these battalions, and basically sent out into certain death. So this was a way of kind of taking all hope away from the men to make them think like, I got no other options, I may as well just stay here and fight, and hopefully, Stalin thought, this would help hold the lines against the Germans. And this mandate, this order, didn't really last too long before it was abolished. And this was partly because a lot of the commanders didn't bother setting up any rear guards. They thought, it's a waste of my men, all of my men should be at the front, they should be fighting instead of waiting around at the back for the men who may or may not retreat. And also, this caused a lot of resentment in the soldiers and the commanders, because a lot of these soldiers did genuinely want to fight and die for their country. But if they were in a completely hopeless situation and it made more strategic sense to retreat a little bit, get a better position, hold this area a little better, a little more effectively, they were not able to do this because any retreat meant that you were just killed. So it wasn't great from a morale perspective. It wasn't really great from a strategic perspective. It made a lot of sense from Stalin's perspective, but Stalin's perspective was, for the most part, kind of outside of these battles. And so strategically or, logically in his head, he thought, okay, that probably makes sense. But when you're actually down on the ground fighting the battles, it sometimes did make sense to retreat at least a little bit. The Cayujo incident. So towards the end of the war, Germany had already surrendered by this point. Hitler was dead, Mussolini had been killed, and the only remaining Axis power really was Japan. And they were clearly outnumbered, British Navy and military and the Americans and the Russians were all surrounding them, and obviously also the Australians, the Irish, the New Zealandish, as I got told off for not including some of these other countries in the last video. But basically the entire Allied forces and the Soviet Union all looked now to invade Japan. And so, to stop any additional bombs being dropped on Japan and to stop any unnecessary deaths of Japanese soldiers and civilians, the Japanese higher-ups were basically looking to surrender. But some of the holdouts, like Major Kenji Hatanaka, did not want to surrender at any cost, even if that meant the US dropped 50 more nukes on them. To them, it was just a matter of honor. And so, Hatanaka, along with a bunch of other men from the Ministry of War of Japan and with some others from the Imperial Army, decided to attempt a coup. They killed Lieutenant General Takeshi Mori and tried faking an official order, saying that these men were permitted entry to the Tokyo Imperial Palace. And from there, they tried putting the Emperor of Japan, who he himself wanted to surrender, but they tried putting him under house arrest. This basically all fell through. They couldn't convince enough people to go along with them. And in the end, the leading men in this coup, for their failure to succeed in their mission, they performed seppuku, putting an end to both themselves and to the Kyujo incident or coup. Japan then announced their surrender that same day, which then put an end, obviously, to World War II. The secret Nazi hideaway in the heart of the Andean jungle. So if you'll recall, towards the end of World War II, more and more Nazis were looking for ways to escape being captured and killed. They had various routes and forms of transport set up that would take them in secret to various countries and to hideouts all around the world. And one of the major places for this was, of course, Argentina. And this was in part because their leader, President Juan Perón, was fairly sympathetic to the Nazi cause, and there was also various German populations already over there. There were escape lines set up to Argentina, and so really it made the most sense of, the place to escape to. And in 2015, there was this post that came about kind of purporting that these buildings had been built by the Nazis in order to hide out and to house them when they escaped to Argentina. But this particular post, at least from what I can find, is very likely a hoax. These buildings were built, in fact, by Jesuit missionaries who came over in the 17th and 18th century, and not by the Nazis who came over in the 1940s. But that isn't to say that the Nazis never came here. Everything about there being pipelines for the Nazis, the top-ranking Nazi officials, is completely true. A bunch of them did escape here. A substantial German population did, arise here. And the leader of Argentina was always sympathetic towards the Nazis, with him refusing to deport or punish any of the Nazis who made their way over into Argentina. And one example of this is Adolf Eichmann and also Joseph Mengele, the angel of death, the dark surgeon. And he lived here for many years despite all of the Allied countries requesting his extradition. But as for these buildings, they were very likely not, sadly, built by the Nazis. Earhart was a spy is a very interesting theory that says that Amelia Earhart, who we covered in the Unsolved Mysteries Iceberg, was actually a spy for America. Now, Earhart herself was an absolutely flying ace. She was one of the best pilots in the world in her time. And while she was doing her famous flight, her flight around the world, her plane mysteriously went missing somewhere over this area in the Pacific. And both her plane and herself were never found. But this theory suggests that Amelia Earhart was actually an American spy, and she was either shot down by the Nazis because they found out, or she genuinely crashed, she survived the crash, and then was captured and interrogated by the Japanese, and they then discovered her being a spy, and so they had her killed. And it is a bit of a wild theory. There's not too much evidence for it. I did cover some other theories in the other video that says that she was eaten by these coconut crabs, for example, which is absolutely terrifying. But yeah, this theory says that she was basically flying around the world as an excuse, and while she was over the Pacific, she was using her plane to take aerial photographs of the entire area, which would obviously be extremely beneficial for the Allies. Dr. Seuss goes to war. So in the last World War II Iceberg, we covered the fact that Walt Disney fought in World War I, and he also produced propaganda through his company Disney for America in World War II. But did you also know that Dr. Seuss served in World War II as well? Not really as a soldier, but as a captain in the 1st Motion Picture Unit. This was based in Hollywood, and it was basically responsible for creating these training films and these pamphlets and this war propaganda for the United States during the war. And almost all of these were compiled into an easy-to-read, easy-to-digest collection that was named Dr. Seuss Goes to War. And it is a little strange looking at these posters and images because they're very clearly, unmistakably like in the style of Dr. Seuss. It's like I'm reading The Grinch or something, but they obviously, like they depict Hitler and the Nazis and the soldiers during World War II, and it just is a very strange feeling. And also, as I was researching this, I found out that not only did Walt Disney and Ray Kroc, the founder of McDonald's, serve in World War II, as did as well Ernest Hemingway, but also Hitler, Otto Frank, who was Anne Frank's father, and J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote The Lord of the Rings, they all fought in the same battle during World War I, that being the Battle of the Somme, with Otto serving in the German Imperial Army, Hitler serving on the same side but in the Bavarian Army, and on the other side you had J.R.R. Tolkien fighting in the British Army. And yes, to some people, this might be very obvious. All of these people from around this sort of era, they typically did serve in the wars, be that World War I or II, but it is just fascinating to think or to imagine how different the world might be if any single one of these people, Hitler or J.R.R. Tolkien in particular, I think, if either of these men had died during that battle. And I know Disney and Hemingway, for example, weren't on the front lines themselves, but if they had died, you wouldn't have Lord of the Rings, you wouldn't have Disney, you maybe wouldn't have World War II if Hitler had died, or you would have had a different version of it probably. You wouldn't have had McDonald's as we all know and love it today. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba. No. And as well as all of that, Stan Lee, who I'm sure you all know from the comic books, Stan Lee served in the same division as Dr. Seuss. So yeah, just a very fascinating little tidbit to think about. The Mulberry Harbors. So the Mulberry Harbors were an absolutely insane operation, feat, achievement that took place in 1944 between Britain and France. And the situation they had, was America and Britain and the other allies, they needed to capture France to take it back from the Germans. But in order to capture France, they needed, tanks, they needed vehicles, they needed men, and there was this pesky little bit of water definitely between America and France, but also between Britain and France. And so they needed to bring all of their stuff over on ships and boats, and for the most part, they needed some sort of dock, some sort of harbor to unload all of these supplies. Because if you can imagine, if you've got a tank on a ship, it's like, yeah, you can move the ship kind of up to the coastline. If you push it too far in, it'll either get destroyed on the rocks or get sunk into the sand. And then how do you get the tank off? Do you just roll it? It'll just roll straight into the water. There's no feasible way to get it onto the land. So the obvious thing would be to capture a French port. Once you had the port, you could sail ships in, you could deliver stuff to the port or unload it on the port and then just drive everything onto the land and everything's sorted. So in 1942, the Allies had attempted to capture a French port held by the Germans, that being Dieppe over here, and it was just a complete failure. Over half of the 6,000 men that landed on or near Dieppe were either captured, killed, or badly injured, and the Allies just kind of left with their tail between their legs, and with the lesson learned that yes, attacking a heavily fortified port is nigh impossible. So they couldn't realistically easily capture a port, but they needed a port to bring over their supplies for the land invasion. So, what do you even do? Well, I'll tell you what you do, or rather I will let Vice Admiral John Hughes Hallett tell you what to do, or tell you what you do. But he said, and I quote, that if a port could not be captured, that we should take one across the channel. That being, you build your own entire harbour from floating concrete islands in Britain over a year in complete secret. You hide them underneath the ocean, and then when D-Day comes around, you send thousands of men over to the beaches in France and you float them across the channel over into France. And these reinforced concrete islands used in total over 1 million tons of concrete, and they basically floated them all over to France. They sunk them down into the ocean near France, or next to the shore, and they just kind of stacked them up like Lego blocks. And so they built these essentially concrete towers sticking out of the ocean, and then they used these other floating platforms to link between them. They used a bunch of old and abandoned ships to basically drop in this area outside of the harbor, and this was to create kind of a wave breaker, which in turn protected the harbor from the harshness of the ocean. And in all, they constructed an entire harbor out of thin air, complete with everything: docks, cranes to get supplies off the docks, platforms, roads, just everything. And they actually made two, one for the Americans and one for the British, but the American one was destroyed shortly after in one of the craziest storms ever seen in this area. You know, it was dubbed the storm of the century, and so the American harbor was kind of smashed to pieces, but the British one, dubbed Port Winston after Winston Churchill, survived the storm, and through this harbor they moved over 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies. So it really was an insane project. It's never been done before on this scale. I mean, floating concrete islands across the channel and then building a harbor from scratch in a cave with a box of scraps, you know, and then after serving its purpose, after 10 months, the harbor was officially decommissioned and it was shut down, and that was the end of one of the many mind-boggling, insane feats and achievements during World War II. The America Bomber was a plan, a fairly general plan, for Germany to basically bomb America. And the plan was to develop some sort of aircraft capable of flying from Berlin all the way to America and in turn bombing them. And at the time, the Germans did actually have aircraft that was capable of making this journey, but it was much lighter aircraft. They were used mainly for reconnaissance, and they weren't really capable of carrying bombs or of attacking in any major way. Hitler apparently was fascinated with the idea of seeing New York up in flames, and in 1938, Hermann Goering, the commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, he gave a speech that said, "I completely lack the bombers capable of round-trip flights to New York," with, of course, a 4.5-ton bomb load. I would be extremely happy to possess such a bomber, which would at last stuff the mouth of arrogance across the sea. With that mouth of arrogance, he was referring to obviously being America. And in this plan, this program, the Germans had as targets 21 sites across the United States, across Canada, and across Greenland, with most of them being in America and most of them being in New York, Connecticut, Vermont, etc., just basically the very east coast of America. And almost all of these targets were companies that manufactured parts for planes, meaning that Germany was likely looking to completely cripple the American planes and to take them out of the skies. But although a few ideas were put forward, some prototypes built, there was never really at any time a plane capable, at least fully capable, of anything like this, you know, dropping heavy bombs all across New York. And so this never really went further than just kind of a general plan. Wojtek was a Syrian brown bear that served in the 22nd Artillery Supply Company for Poland during World War II. And he was gifted 2 Polish soldiers by an Iranian shepherd and was then taken aboard into the Polish army. He ended up fighting in the Battle of Monte Cassino. He carried ammunition crates for the men, and he was promoted from private to corporal. And then after the war ended, he was relieved from the army, and he lived out the rest of his life in the Edinburgh Zoo in Scotland. So yeah, just a wild tale, an absolutely beautiful one, as every entry that involves animals always is. Tier 3, the unkillable soldier. So a few of you mentioned this guy in the previous video, and I've seen some videos about him, and he is just absolutely insane. And while a lot of this story does take place before World War II, I thought you would appreciate just how unbelievable this man and his accomplishments and his injuries actually were. And I was told to read the first paragraph of his Wikipedia entry, so I mean, here goes. I think it does sum it up quite well. But it starts with Lieutenant General Sir Adrian Paul Guillain Carton de Wart was a British Army officer of Belgian and Irish descent. He was awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest military decoration awarded for valor in the face of the enemy in various Commonwealth countries. He served in the Boer War, the First World War, and the Second World War. He was shot in the face, the head, the stomach, the groin, the ankle, the leg, the hip, and ear. He was also blinded in his left eye, survived 2 plane crashes, tunneled out of a prisoner of war camp, and cut off his own severely injured fingers when a doctor declined to amputate them. Describing his experiences in the First World War, he wrote, "Frankly, I had enjoyed the war." And so, he was just a bonkers man. He was born in 1880 to a fairly well-off family, and so, he had a good education. He spoke French and English. He had also learned Arabic. He later learned Polish. He was a very smart man, but his life was somewhat planned out. His family was wealthy. His plan was to go to college, to study law, to work in law, and obviously to never really worry about money or anything ever again. And so what did he decide to do at the age of 19? Well, he decided to leave his school to sneak off to South Africa without telling his family or his father and to join the Boer War. And he actually offered himself up as a soldier to either the Boers or the English. He said, "I don't really care which side of the war I fight on, I just want to fight someone." And so the British took him, and while fighting there, he gets shot in the leg and in the groin, and so then gets sent home. And when he's home, his dad obviously says, "Where the hell have you been? You were supposed to be studying law." Carton says that he doesn't want to study law, he wants to fight, and so his dad kind of allows him to do this, and he gets redeployed to South Africa. Then he serves as the head of the Camel Corps, which was this group of men, these group of soldiers that basically rode into battle on camels. And while fighting here, he gets shot in the eye, or rather he gets shot in the ear and then the eye, and then he gets shot by another bullet that ricochets and hits him in the same eye. So he's basically fully blinded in the left eye. He gets sent back home, and then this is around the time of the First World War. And he, of course, wants to fight. Of course, he wants to be put on the front lines. And the British say, look, if we send you out there, a man with an eye patch, it'll look like to the enemy that we're sending out our weak soldiers. And so if you want us to send you out to the front line, you need to wear this fake eye. And so he agrees to this. He goes to the hospital, they install this fake eye, and he says, "Yeah, okay, fine, I'll wear it." And then as he's in the taxi leaving the hospital, he just rips out the fake eye, throws it out the window, puts his eye patch back on, and then joins the war on the front lines anyway. And almost immediately when he's out here, he gets hit by exploding shrapnel, which basically blows off his hand almost completely, leaving just 2 fingers hanging on by the flesh. The surgeons say they refuse to amputate these fingers because they want him to rest up in the infirmary. They want the skin and the flesh to heal up as much as it can. And Carton just says no, he wants to fight. This is an inconvenience to him. And he literally, in front of the surgeons, just grabs his last 2 remaining fingers and just tears them off. And they later had to amputate basically half of his arm because the damage from the shrapnel was that bad. So now he's a one-eyed, one-armed man who still insists on fighting in the war on the front lines. So they send him out to fight in the Battle of the Somme. This is still in World War I. And here he is reported by some of the other soldiers as pulling out grenades, with his teeth, because he's only got one hand, pulling out grenades, throwing them at the enemy, firing his revolver at them because it helps to fire a one-handed gun if you're one-handed, and also reloading that same revolver with only one hand. And so he was just like this crazy psychopath man, just charging at the enemy blindly, throwing grenades, killing multiple soldiers with his pistol. And while he is here, he gets shot again through the back of the head. He survives that. He's then promoted for a single day before threatening to punch his superior in the face. And for this, he is of course then swiftly, demoted. He ends up taking over 3 separate squadrons, which each of them have no leader or had no leader at the time. And he commands each of them, but since they have no kind of communication between them, he kind of volunteers himself to instruct one of them and then to run to the other squadron himself, not send a messenger, not send a carrier pigeon or anything. No, he's just sprinting on the front lines from one squadron to the other repeatedly, giving them all orders, kind of syncing them all up together. And for this, he was awarded the Victoria Cross, which is kind of like the equivalent of the Medal of Honor in America. And he was also shot a handful more times during this part of the war. And this is, if you'll remember, the First World War, of which he wrote, "Frankly, I had enjoyed the war." He had enjoyed getting his arm blown off, ripping off his fingers. He was just an absolute machine of a man. Then we move on to the Second World War, and by this point, Carton is around 60 years old, and so he very easily could have had just a normal, quiet life. They weren't exactly forcing 60-year-olds out into the front lines during this war. But Carton is like, no, send me out there, I want to fight. They say, okay, we can't send you out to the front lines, but he basically gets drafted to do these covert secret operations, these secret missions. And while he is flying in a plane over to Romania, his plane gets shot down by a German plane, leading to him and his men basically crashing down into the water below and leaving them stranded, floating with a German plane flying overhead, trying to shoot them. And they did, after this plane crash, they did have a floating dinghy, but Carton said that if they had gotten in the dinghy, they would have been such an easy target for this German plane shooting at them. And so instead, this 60-year-old Carton with one eye and one arm and all of the other men decided to basically float in the water, or to rather stay below the surface and then just come up for air. And they did this for quite a while until the German plane ran out of ammunition. And then once it flew off, they got into the dinghy, they went ashore, they were rescued, they went back to base. Then Carton goes on another mission in another plane. He again gets shot down, his plane hits the water, and he swims to shore. Again, with one arm, one eye, 60 years old, he swims to shore carrying one of his other men because he was so badly injured that he couldn't swim. And so I guess with his half arm, he's like holding the other man and he's swimming with his other arm to the shore. Like, it's just an insane thing to imagine. So he gets to shore. He's then captured by the Italians. He gets put in a prisoner of war camp. He digs a 60-meter tunnel through the earth, and on his 6th breakout attempt, he manages to escape this tunnel and spends a week hiding out in northern Italy. And while he is out here, the Italians are all looking for him, but somehow he still remains uncaptured, unfound, despite being perhaps one of the most easily recognizable men. He's got all of these scars, all of these injuries, he's got one eye, one arm, and he doesn't speak any Italian, and he somehow manages to, get food and water and evade capture in northern Italy. But he's then basically rescued. The Italians, by this point, are kind of near surrendering, and they say, look, you were in one of our prisoner of war camps for like 9 months. We treated you pretty fairly. You're not injured. You're not all scrawny. What if we buy you a expensive Italian suit, just as our way of saying thanks, and in exchange, you tell the British and the Allies that, the Italians aren't so bad, and maybe this can, buy us a little leeway, a little generosity, etc. from the Allies. At least that was probably the hope of the Italians. But Carton declined this offer, and he basically told them instead to buy him a British suit from Savile Row because he said he didn't want to look like a gigolo or a male prostitute wearing their Italian suit. He also interrupted Chairman Mao of China while he was giving a speech and called him an idiot to his face, and he was just a man who absolutely did not give a damn about anything. He would fight in any battle, in any war. He would go anywhere he wanted. He would slag off world leaders. He, wasn't too worried about being nice or sounding gentle or political or whatever. He was just an honest, down-to-earth, absolute psychopath, and that is the story of the immortal soldier. Operation Mincemeat was a secret British operation that basically intended to bamboozle the Germans by feeding them false plans and information. And so the British government, they got a homeless man who had died naturally. I mean, he died from rat poison, but like he wasn't murdered specifically for this plan or anything. He was a dead homeless man in Wales, and the government took his body, dressed him up like a Royal Marine, and they gave him a fake ID with the name Captain William Martin. They planted on his body all the things you'd expect from an actual soldier, you know, photos of his loved ones, fake handwritten letters from officers and also from his loved ones, little trinkets and stuff that he took to war with him. He had a whole backstory, a love life, a personality, and they also placed on him these top secret confidential plans for the British to attack Greece on a particular date. Except there was no such plan to attack Greece, and this whole operation actually worked. The homeless man, Glyndwr Michael, was prepared, he was dumped into the ocean, and he was soon found by the Germans. And they naturally searched his body, they found these secret plans, they passed them on to Hitler, and Hitler actually did divert some troops over to Greece in order to prepare for this attack. And then, of course, the attack never came because it was never actually a real plan. So even in death, Glyndwr Michael and his mission was a complete success and did save the lives of many Allied soldiers in the process. Kokura luck refers to the fact that Kokura, which was a city in Japan, was actually the target for one of the nuclear strikes. But as the bomber plane was flying over and towards Kokura, due to the previous day's firebombing, the skies were all smoky and cloudy. And so after flying by 3 times and running low on fuel, the bomber just went to their secondary target, that being Nagasaki. And of course, this is where the nuclear bomb was dropped. And so the people of Kokura were extremely lucky that day that they weren't basically nuked. And so Kokura luck is sometimes used as a phrase like, oh, someone's got Kokura luck today, to refer to when someone is extremely lucky. Operation Unthinkable was a war plan that the British made against the Soviet Union, kind of in case of any emergency. And so as the war was ending, Germany was defeated, everything was calm, except the US and the British and the Soviets were kind of like frenemies. They were friends in that they had teamed up to defeat the Axis powers, mostly Germany, but they also weren't really allies. And so it was completely plausible that the Soviet Union might suddenly switch and start attacking or bombing or invading Allied territory. The Soviets were probably a little bit afraid of the American nukes, but it was always certainly a possibility. And the first plan that the Allies made was basically a preemptive strike on the Soviets in Germany to, and I quote, impose the will of the United States and British Empire upon Russia. They ended up not going through with this plan because they weren't sure if they actually could fully pull it off. They also weren't sure that they wanted the Soviets as an active enemy or whether they could even fight an extended war against the Soviets. But they still always did keep an eye on them and were always cognizant of, what they might do, where they might attack. And this basically, evolved into what became the Cold War in the coming years. The BFC, or British Free Corps, was a British unit of the Waffen-SS for Nazi Germany. And basically this was all started by a British man named John Amory, and he was a big supporter of the Nazis. So he traveled down to Berlin in 1942 to collaborate with the Germans, and he came up with the idea of the British Free Corps and said, look, if we get a bunch of these British prisoners of war, we give them some rewards, we treat them nice, we show them all the good things that Germany is doing in Europe, across the world, and convince them that the real enemy are the Soviets, then the idea was they would be able to recruit a bunch of these British prisoners of war and to supplement their army size and basically use them to help fight Stalin in the East. And so they did go through with all of this, but honestly, a lot of the men didn't really eat up the propaganda. And there's accounts of them saying like, yeah, we didn't really believe the propaganda, but this particular camp that they had, which they would kind of funnel prisoners of war into and through, that was just seen as like a nice kind of holiday camp in a way. You know, the other prisoner of war camps, you would just be treated like a prisoner of war. But if you were chosen to come here, you would get a few weeks of being treated nicely, and you would get, you know, different rewards, all in an attempt to win these prisoners over to the German side. But the entire corps was ever only at a maximum of around 27 men, and so it wasn't a big thing by any means. And after the war, the corps was obviously disbanded. The founder of it, the British John Amory, he was charged with high treason and sentenced to death. And the regular soldiers who joined this corps, they were charged with like various minor crimes, for example, sabotage or aiding the enemy, even though most of the men said, you know, I didn't really want to join, but either I wasn't given a choice, or, you know, I said I would go along with them, but that was just really to get intelligence on the Germans. And then I was planning on somehow reporting stuff back, or to being kind of a spy for the British. And so, yeah, the soldiers who did join were punished, but not insanely massively. And that was the strange story of the BFC. Constanze Manziali was the cook and dietitian of Hitler from 1944 until his death in 1945. And Constanze didn't like her job too much. She wrote a number of letters back home to her family, basically saying how horrible the job was and how horrible the living and working conditions were. And at the end, when Hitler told a few of the, you know, the people closest to him, he told them what his plan was. He wasn't going to leave Berlin. He was going to, you know, himself in the bunker. Even after he told her and a few other people to just leave, to get out while they could, she still decided to stay in the bunker. And so, soon after Hitler died, the Soviets came into the bunker, and Constanze was last seen being taken away by two Soviet soldiers, with her quoted as saying, "It's fine, they just want to see my papers." And then she was never seen again. It's possible that she was killed in the city and disposed of somehow, or perhaps she was taken prisoner by the Soviets, she was interrogated, or just sent off to a Soviet forced labor camp. But yeah, ultimately, we don't really know. Weather Station Kurt was an automatic weather station that was set up by a German submarine crew in Newfoundland in 1943. And they literally just drove their U-boat all the way over here from Germany, and they set up this weather station which ran on these batteries and automatically measured the weather, and then sent these readings out on a certain radio wavelength that the Germans could receive and read. And one big reason for this was that weather conditions often traveled from west to east. And so the Americans over here would get their weather readings early, and by the time it made its way over to Europe, it was only then that the Germans were able to get their weather readings, which was obviously well behind the Americans, which meant that with the American intel, they could plan farther ahead. And so the Germans thought, you know, screw this, we're going to put weather stations out in America so that we too can get this early weather information. And that is more or less exactly what they did. They had various weather stations in the Antarctic sort of area, but this particular one, named Weather Station Kurt, was the only one that the Germans set up in the entirety of North America. This station could run on its own, sending data back to Germany for around 6 months until the batteries died. And this particular one was actually forgotten about until after the war, when it was rediscovered and found in 1977. Piper Bill, or William, or Bill Millen, was a Canadian-British soldier who was the personal piper, because apparently that was a thing in World War II, but he was the personal piper for a man named Simon Fraser, who was a commander in the British 1st Special Service Brigade that fought during D-Day. And while he and the men around him during the D-Day landing were being bombarded with bombs and shells and gunfire, he was just playing his bagpipes. And it's kind of interesting because the use of bagpipes was actually restricted in World War II to the rear lines. Like, they basically said, you know, no playing bagpipes on the front lines, but Simon ignored this order and he commanded his piper, Bill Millen, to play anyway. And when Bill said, isn't that kind of against the law? Isn't that against the rules? Simon said, but that's the English War Office. You and I are both Scottish, and that doesn't apply. And this was again as all the bombs and explosions and shrapnel and gunshots were whistling above underneath them. As soldiers left and right were dying, he was playing the bagpipes, hopefully keeping some of their morale alive. And he ended up surviving this battle, and later said he talked with some captured British snipers who told Millen that they had him in their sights, but that they didn't shoot him because they said he wasn't carrying a weapon, he wasn't a threat, and they thought that he had just gone mad. The 100-man killing contest. So this entry explores something called the Nanjing Massacre. And if you haven't heard about this, sorry to ruin your day, but it was this insane, brutal attack on the Chinese by the Japanese in World War II. It has also been called the Rape of Nanjing, which I'll probably have to censor that. And it was called this for, I think, very obvious reasons. And it is considered by many one of the worst, most brutal atrocities in the entirety of modern history. And so the Japanese invaded China, they took over Shanghai, and their next goal was to take over Nanjing, so this city here. And both on the journey to the city and once they actually entered Nanjing, they just started killing and attacking everyone. Between 20 and 80,000 women and children were raped, more than 30,000 prisoners of war were killed, and between 60 and 110,000 civilians were murdered quite brutally. They would target, young girls, middle-aged women, elderly women. They didn't really care. They would impale children and newborn babies on their bayonets. And I'm sure I'm going to have to blur or censor a ton of these images because they are just absolutely brutal. You can look up some for yourself if you really want to. But this particular entry, the 100-man killing contest, is in regards to these two Japanese soldiers, these Japanese army officers, Toshiaki Mukai and Tsuyoshi Noda, who were said to have had a 100-man killing contest between them of basically a contest who can kill 100 men first, only using their swords and in the coolest fashion. And it is really a brutal, sickening event. As I said, you can research it some more if you would really like to, and if you want to be extra sad tonight. But after the war, these two particular officers were arrested. They were both executed for these war crimes, for slaughtering civilians and prisoners of war, etc. And so at least there is some justice for this. But yeah, as far as the total Nanjing massacre goes, hardly any of the regular soldiers were actually punished for this. It was mostly just the guys commanding the massacre, the people in control who ended up being punished. But yeah, a very sick little competition during a very sick time and massacre. Maureen Flavin was a post mistress, so a female postman basically, or post person, working in the Department of Posts and Telegraphs in Kerry in Ireland. And while there, she discovered that the post office also doubled as a weather station of sorts, and one of her jobs became relaying weather reports taken here over to the British Met, and they would then be able to use that information to better plan attacks and operations. And since this was on the very west coast of Ireland, they got a lot of their weather information long before England and of course long before Germany. And Maureen was responsible for making these hourly reports and sending them over to Britain. And at 1 a.m. on the 3rd of June, just days before the planned D-Day invasion, she detected a slight drop in air pressure and a change in wind. And these two things combined were kind of the first signs of an oncoming storm. So she informed Britain. They delayed D-Day by a single day, and this saved many, many lives, as the day prior to D-Day, when it was originally planned to have taken place, there ended up being a massive storm. And so again, one of the kind of unsung heroes of World War II was this Maureen Flavin, an Irish postal office worker. And it's kind of funny, they had to do all of this kind of on the down low because officially Ireland was a neutral country, and so they couldn't really be helping England in any massive way, except they had, a ton of Irish soldiers enlisted in the war, and they did things like this to help out Britain and the Allies. And so yeah, they were basically on the side of the Allies, although not officially. The German three-wheeled Goliath remote demolition vehicles. So these were this very cool invention, and the original inspiration for them dates back to World War I. These little kind of remote control little tiny tank explosion thingies. But then regular full-size tanks came along. Nobody really used these smaller ones anymore. But during World War II, they saw more and more use. They were improved upon, especially by the Germans, and they were essentially these mini tanks around 5 feet long, 2 feet high, and they could travel around 6 kilometers or 4 miles per hour. And there was both gas-powered ones and electric-powered ones. And the electric-powered ones were powered by this cable that basically went out on a long, I don't know, it was a super long cable, and they were able to control and power the tank via this cable. So they would drive the tank out, the cable would just kind of trail behind it, and the cable would often stretch to around 650 meters or over 2,000 feet, meaning that they could fill these little tiny tanks filled with explosives between 50k and 100k of high explosives. And while these tanks could be shot at, they could fall into ditches or the cable behind them could be cut. If they did manage to actually make their way out to their target, be it, a tank or a bridge or a group of men or a vehicle or something, the controllers would then trigger the explosives via the cable and it would cause enormous amounts of damage. So a very cool little World War II invention that honestly looks like something out of Home Alone or something. The White Death was the name, the myth, the legend of a man named Simo Häyhä, who was one of the most successful, the greatest snipers of all time. And his story is really just insane. He grew up as a fairly shy, fairly quiet kid, and he joined the Finnish army when he was 17. And in World War II, the Finnish-Russian lines looked like this, whereas now they look like this. But back in World War II, the Finnish lines were only around 40 kilometers from St. Petersburg, which was one of Russia's major cities. And so Russia tried to make a deal with them. They tried to trade them some land, asking them, to give them this little buffer of land around St. Petersburg. But Finland didn't really want to, they didn't agree to anything, and so the Soviets decided to just invade Finland. And as a member of the defense force, Simo was tasked with mainly using his sniper rifle to pick off targets when and where he could. And as it turns out, he was absolutely incredible at this. He also had various other tasks of leading, various attacks and doing patrols, which he typically used a machine gun for these, but while he was sniping, while he was sneaking around and scouting, he used a Mosin-Nagant variant rifle produced in Finland, which was a very nice, very effective rifle. He would dress in all white with obviously layers of warm clothes below, and this allowed him to almost completely blend into the snowy landscape. And this was of course in contrast to the invading Soviets, who for some reason, even though they were invading into a snowy land, they often had these dark brown uniforms, which it turns out made them very easy to spot in the snow. And Simo was such an expert when it came to sniping. He was only 5'3" or 160 centimeters, and so this actually helped him in being able to sneak around, to travel more lightly and more easily, and he would often scout out the perfect vantage and sniping points. He would camp there for hours until the enemy appeared, and he mostly only surprisingly used his iron sights, so no scope as a sniper. He said that the scope was mostly problematic, it would fog up, it could make it hard to see, and it could also give, little glints of lights reflected off the sun or reflected off the snow, and this would sometimes potentially give away his position. And so almost all of the time he just used his iron sights, and he was able to estimate distances with the naked eye of up to 150 meters within the margin of error of 1 meter. And so he would just, look out at this landscape. You would see this tree way off in the distance, and he would say, that tree is 137 meters away, and it would always be no more than a meter different, which is absolutely insane. I mean, obviously he would need to be this good at estimating distances if he was using his sniper, super effectively, or his sniper rifle. And he also, as well as that, he used to keep snow in his mouth, which was to bring down the temperature of his mouth so that he wasn't breathing out warm air and, turning it into fog, which might give away his position. He would also pour water kind of around where he was firing his rifle, and this was to melt the top layer of fluffy, dusty snow, so that when he fired the rifle and it kind of kicked up a little bit, it didn't shoot this powder up into the air, which would again give away his position. He would also dig himself into the snow and then pile up snow kind of behind him, behind his position, and this was so that he didn't give off a silhouette behind him. And so yeah, as you can see, as you can tell, all of these things, just these minor things, were what made him so incredibly effective. He took a great deal of care in staying hidden, in stalking his targets, and in actually firing his rifle and hitting them. And over the course of 98 days fighting the Soviets, he amassed an estimated 542 kills, averaging around 5.5 a day, with one particular day showing around 25 kills. He was known by some as the White Death, he was known by others as the Magic Shooter, and the Soviets would try and track him in the snow and fire at him, which of course he was never really hit by any of this. They also tried blowing up trees in the area, firing mortar and shells up into wherever they suspected he was, and none of this ended up hitting him. He never really flinched, they were never able to see his position, but he was eventually struck by an explosive bullet fired by one of the Soviets, and this basically hit him in the jaw. It ended up blowing up his jaw and leaving him unconscious. And because of this, because it was an insane wound and he was unconscious, he was at the time thought to be dead. And so when he was found, he was dragged off and dumped onto this big pile of bodies before one of the Finnish men saw his foot kind of twitching a little bit, and they called the medics over. He woke up for a short while before falling back into a week-long coma, before waking up just as the peace treaty with the Soviets was being signed. And as I said, he was quite a quiet, humble man in his youth, and that never really changed throughout his life. He often didn't like talking about the war. He didn't really talk about his accomplishments or his kills during the war, even though he had the most confirmed kills of any sniper in history, fighting for only less than 100 days. But he never really talked about it. He never bragged about it. He just lived a humble little life, farming and chopping trees, with him later quoted as saying that he felt remorse for having killed so many people, calling them his 500 sins, and said that I did what I was told as well as I could. There would be no Finland unless everyone had done the same. He died at the ripe old age of 96, and he was buried in his hometown of Ruokolahti. Again, sorry Finnish people, I do not know how to pronounce a lot of these, but that is the incredible story and tale of the White Death. Mexico Platz. So during World War II, Germany here annexed Austria here. And I don't want to be offensive to anyone, but they are fairly similar countries, somewhat similar cultures, similar peoples, etc. And they're not the same, I get that, they're not identical, but Hitler felt that these were all just the same German people. They had different local traditions and all of that, but basically everyone here was German. And he said, look, we're all the same guys. We shouldn't have two countries. We should just all join forces. And when Austria was like, we don't really want to join forces, Hitler was like, no, trust me, you do. And so he marched over there with some troops and they annexed Austria into Greater Germany in 1938. And the only country in the world at that time to openly support Austria against the German annexation was Mexico. They said, this wasn't right. They filed a formal complaint with the League of Nations saying that this annexation was an attack on international law, and Austria never forgot this. So in 1958, to honor this support, they built a square in Vienna, which is the capital city of Austria. They built a square called the Mexico Platz, or the Mexico Square. It's pretty cool. It looks pretty nice. It's a nice gesture, and it is still something that exists and you can still visit to this day. Cargo cults is a very fun and interesting one, but as you can imagine, in and around World War II, there was a massive Allied, mostly American presence in the Pacific, and in a bunch of small islands there, populated mostly or solely by indigenous tribes of people. And these indigenous tribes, they would often observe these US soldiers landing with planes. They would observe them doing various things, talking on their radios, saluting their superiors, doing marches and that sort of thing. And then there would be a cargo drop from God, or, from a plane in the sky. But for the tribesmen observing this, they thought that these Americans, these strange people, had kind of figured out a ritual to God, whatever God it was, and this God would then bless them with this cargo, with supplies and weapons and goods, etc. And so, while these soldiers were here, and even after they left, the tribesmen were observed making mock runways, mock airplanes, mock radios, doing various military walks and salutes and routines, all to try and copy this ritual that they saw and to bring down some cargo from the heavens. It's a really cool observation on mankind, honestly, on how we learn as people, the patterns we recognize, etc. And yeah, just looking at some of these photos, observing these, it is just a very cool piece, I think, of human history.